chilly in here? Oops.
Grab some coffee if you need to. We'll have lunch. 12:15, 12:20. I shouldn't say the time. Whenever he's finished.
Yeah, that has never happened yet. All right, let's pick it up where we left. Actually, what I'm going to do, and I just came up with this idea this morning, so see how it works, but rather than trying to just survey the events, and I'm going to say again, you have a set of notes which is fairly thorough with regard to, not thorough, but it's a good survey. But I want to break it down. We've surveyed the days of the week: Sunday presentation, Monday and Tuesday proclamation, given Sunday, why Friday? Because Jesus drives the city to decision. Silent Wednesday, Thursday, day of preparation. Friday, prosecution, and then perfection. Sunday, proclamation. But let's get a little more granular. And I'm just going to ask several, I think, fascinating questions to which the Bible provides an answer by my lights. And the first one is, how did Jesus get away with it? Now, I want you to take your notes, and it's fairly brief, but if you go to page 5, I summarize 2 events which are preparatory to the triumphal entry. And then on pages 9 and 10, I actually deal with the triumphal entry. But might be helpful. It's not, they're not going to be all that essential, but that is the notes. Well, let's follow the PowerPoint. How did Jesus get away with it? Now, what do I mean by this? Folks, you have to understand, I already said this, that the Roman Empire, number one, think about this, the Roman Empire was newly minted. It was a brand new empire. We usually date it from 27 AD when the Senate gave Augustan veto power, but the fact is that not but a couple of decades earlier, now we're at 30 AD with Jesus' ministry, and 33 with regard to the triumphal entry, but just a few decades earlier, all across the Mediterranean world, there were kingdoms and small empires and there were ruling families who lived pretty well. That was all gone. Rome had crushed everybody. And so Rome was absolutely paranoid. And I like to say that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean nobody's chasing you. You know what I'm saying? You may have good reason to be paranoid. And Rome was paranoid about sedition, about rebellion, about, most basically, pretender kings. So I'm taking, because in this and that corner, there was this family. They were the royal family for a lot of generations. Now they're just one of the boys, or maybe they're hiding in caves. And the Roman Empire, the army is spread all over the place. And so in this or that corner, maybe some element of the population says, I don't think Rome's strong enough to maintain their control here, and they have sedition. And Rome would not put up with it. And the one place in all of their empire where they had more seditious activity than any other was Israel. Israel was constantly rising up for a number of reasons that are fun to contemplate. And Rome, basically, their policy was, if you rebel, we are going to put it down in hours. Okay, maybe days, but certainly not more than that. And they're going to bring just overwhelming force. And by the way, they're not going to worry about collateral damage. They're going to use that as a tactic. Not only is that village that gave us trouble going to be wiped out and everybody carried into slavery, but all the villages around, just to make our point. So, so, all right. Rome wouldn't put up with sedition. Little Israel was the one place in their empire where they had more problems with that than any other place. And number 3, it took them forever to put it down, because Rome, you know where the phalanx is? The Greeks had developed, and then they developed this phalanx, just this wall of swords, and they would come marching forth, And Israel, the land of Israel, is like one great big paintball arcade. I mean, it's just made for guerrilla warfare. And the Jews were good at it. So I'm putting it all together. Well, I'll say one other thing, that the one day of the year, the one season of the year, when Rome was most concerned about sedition in Israel, was Passover. Because what is every Jew thinking about at Passover? Remembering a time when their God, in fulfillment of a promise, delivered them from a unspeakably powerful Gentile enemy, namely Egypt. Well, guess what? we got a promise. It's in the book of Daniel. And we are under the heel of a Gentile dominion. So, and Rome was on special alert at Passover season. So I'm back to my question. How did Jesus get away with riding into the city and offering himself clearly, deliberately, unmistakably as their long-awaited king? And this is a good question. Why did the Roman and the Jewish authorities not put a stop to it? Side note, it's just interesting to me, in my studies, nobody asked this question, except one guy. I hear him going back to it all the time. I don't know if you know this name, Bart Ehrman. Do you know that name? Oh, he loves this. He's that evangelical gone bad who teaches it at UNC, and just, I mean, we're right there, and we have a constant issue of students who have been growing up in the church, and they go off to UNC and they take his course and they begin to doubt the scriptures and so on. He's always saying, that's stupid. How could Jesus ride into the city in that day, in that place, and the Romans and the Jews would do nothing about it? It's a good question, all right? So I think we can answer the question biblically. But I'm going to have to back up, and I'm going to really hurry here. I'm talking to myself. There are two events which I think we have to think about very quickly that lay the groundwork for the triumphal entry. And the first, and Dorothy just asked me about this, I'm going to take you there. In Luke 13 and verse 31, let me take you there. Oh, it'll come. Hold on. Now, I'd love to give you the background, and I really don't like to just lift verses off the page. I think it's so important, but I'll just tell you this. What's at stake here is this is about 3 months before Jesus dies. It happens right after the Feast of Dedication in John chapter 10. And you remember, it was in John chapter 10 at the Feast of Dedication. You know what that is? By the way, I don't should do this, but chronology is really important to reconstructing history. You got to understand the chronology. And the chronology of Jesus' life early on is tough because we have kind of general benchmarks, but when you get toward the end of Jesus' ministry, we can really nail it down because John keeps giving us these feasts. And 6 months before he dies, John gives us this long record of the Feast of Tabernacles. That's in October. So that's when Jesus, come unto me if any man thirst, and so on. That's when he heals the blind man and so on. Then Jesus ministers in Judea, and he comes back to Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication. That's John 10 and verse 22. It says Jesus was in Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication, and it was winter. Now, what's the Feast of Dedication? Do you know? What is it? It's Hanukkah. So that's in late December. It was at that feast that Jesus said, I and the Father are one. He so angered his enemies, the Pharisees, they picked up stones to stone him. And so because he was wise as a serpent, he simply made his way over to Perea. Now, Perea, I'll show you maps in a bit, but Perea is to the east of the Jordan River. So here he is in Jerusalem, and he's just going to go down the hill. It's about 15 miles, and cross the Jordan River. Now he is in the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. Pilate was entirely beholden to the Jews. They could make him dance to the tune they piped. Herod Antipas, now Herod, this is not Herod the Great, that's the daddy, this is one of his sons, and he was given Galilee and Perea, and the Jews have no leverage in his life. Yeah, they can't. So Jesus knows that by going to Perea, he's going to frustrate the efforts of the Jews, because the Jews know they can't just kill him because there'll be a riot. They got to get the Romans to do their dirty work, and they're going to do that by convincing the Romans that he's a seditious. That make sense to you? So when Jesus is in Jerusalem, because the Jewish leadership there can get the Pilate to do their bidding, he's in danger. He goes over to Perea. He's going to be there for several weeks, and thousands of people come over, and he's teaching and doing miracles. And in Luke 13, some Pharisees come, and they say, you better get out of here because Herod, that's Herod Antipas. See, it says, get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you. No, that's Herod Antipas. And this is I can walk you through it. I got a couple of pages of notes on this in my Life of Christ notes. But this is a ploy. This is a trick. They're not concerned about Jesus, but they're trying to trick him back into Judea where they can get him dead. Does that make sense to you? Honestly? So Jesus says, he sees through it. He says, nah, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to come. And I'd love to talk to you about his answer. It's really insightful. But he says, it's not going to happen. But then he makes him a promise. And I want you to come to grips with this a little bit. He says in verse 34, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem. He weeps over the city. Now, Dorothy, in this scene, it's absolutely explicit. Let me move it up a little bit. In this scene, Jesus is in Perea. It's several weeks before the triumphal entry. And he says to those Pharisees who run the city of Jerusalem, and he says to them, well, first of all, he weeps over the city. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you know that. Now, that's kind of fascinating because he's at least 12, 15 miles, maybe 20 or 30 miles, depending on where he is in Perea, from Jerusalem. But he is bemoaning, he is weeping over the city. Why? Because these Pharisees run Jerusalem, and they're here to trap him, to trick him back. And he sees in these Pharisees the staggering rejection and unbelief of that city. And so he weeps over the city, but then he makes a promise, all important. He says, your house is left to you desolate. Assuredly, I say, you'll not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, 2 points. Stay with me. Number one, he's quoting from Psalm 118. Psalm 118 is one of the most messianic psalms of the Old Testament. I like to call it a psalm of messianic inauguration. Psalm 118, I would argue, is the psalm that God gave to the Jewish people to tell them how to welcome their Messiah. When your Messiah comes, and by the way, before I get there, I'm playing a trick on you here. There is a verse in Psalm 118 that everybody in the room knows by heart. I guarantee it. Everyone, even your kids. I'm going to make a test. Do you know what verse I'm talking about? All right, now. Do the kids know that? So the verse starts this way. This is the day. Can you finish that verse? Then what? We will. Did you get that? So everybody knows that verse. Now listen, and I don't want to beat up on anybody. But it may be your habit to get up in the morning, and throw open the drapes and beat your chest and say, this is the day which the Lord has made. I'm going to rejoice and be glad in it. Fine, that's wonderful. That's not what the verse is talking about. It's not talking about every day. It's talking about April 29th, 33 AD. It's talking about the day of the triumphal entry. That's what the verse is talking about initially. And what it is saying, and now think about this. This is the day that only Yahweh could produce, the day when that long-promised deliverer of Genesis 3 actually appears. All of human history has been this is the day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice. And this is why when Jesus' enemies try to get the children to stop singing, he says the very stones will cry out. Why? Because this is that long-awaited day that you have waited, that only the Lord could produce. And so the day of Messiah. So my point is simply this. That verse is, Jesus quotes the next verse. That's Psalm 118, verse 24. But then, verse 26 is, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So, 2 points. Number one, what Jesus is saying to those Pharisees late in the winter, early spring perhaps, in Perea, you're not going to see me until you welcome me, until you sing that song. Welcome me as Messiah. Now, here's the point. This is why I like to start with this. If you'd have been there that day, you'd have said, that's not going to happen. These Pharisees hate Jesus. They have murder in their hearts. They run the city. That city is not going to welcome the Nazarene as Messiah. They're not going to bow the knee to his claim to be Messiah. Now, we know the rest of the story. We know the triumphal entry. We know that that's exactly what happens. My point is, I think we can trace how Jesus, because he was wise as a serpent, made it happen. How did he get away with it? Now, one other point to be made in this passage is that verse 25, yes, 25, again, God teaches them to cry out, "Save now." Can you say that in Hebrew? Anybody? You can. What is it? Hoshana, Hosanna. Now, that word has become kind of a worship word, and that's fine, but it doesn't have real connotation. It means something. It means save now. In other words, God taught Israel, you have waited for all those millennia for the deliverer promised in the Garden of Eden. When he appears, you cry out, "Save now, be our deliverer." Does that make sense to you? All right, now, I appeal to this because I think it's important, so important as a backdrop to the triumphal entry. Some weeks or months earlier, Jesus had made a promise that made no sense at all to those angry, murderous Pharisees. You're not going to see me till the city welcomes me as king. That's what happened. How did it happen? All right. In order to start with that answer, the second event, which is preliminary to the, sets the stage so importantly, is in fact the raising of Lazarus. Now, okay, I talk about it a little bit. Here's a map that gives you something of the, I'm not going to go back there. Now, I want to go to John chapter, no, I'm not even going to do it. I'm going to say it very quickly. I think you know this story. I should go, for heaven's sakes. But in John chapter 11, I'm trying to keep myself moving. John chapter 11, John tells this unspeakably important narrative of the raising of Lazarus. Only John tells us this story. But listen, I don't know. Let me just very quickly. What happens is that, we talked about this earlier, while he is in Perea, a messenger comes, says, "The one whom you love is sick." So fascinating, John says, the apostle says, because he loved him, he waited 2 days. And I think the point is that by the Spirit's direction, Jesus contrived to show up on the fourth day. Now, I'll explain why that's important tomorrow, just to make sure you understand. The raising of Lazarus is only as certain, historically, as his death, right? If he didn't really die, then when he comes hopping out, it's not that big a deal. And that's the standard unbelieving explanation today, is that, well, those poor primitive people, they couldn't tell the difference between a man just fainting and being in a coma and dead, and so they buried him not realizing, and the cool air refreshed him, and so he was able to hop out of there. Well, number one, that's demonically insane, that idea. But the fact is that because remember Martha says, "Don't, he'll stink." And I was telling a story yesterday. It just happened a week ago. I was in Washington going through the same stuff, and a woman in there she just told this remarkable story. I had to share it with the congregation about how she was working, and one of the guys didn't show up on Friday, and then didn't show up on Monday. So on Tuesday, he's always here, and he went, and he had died. And he was died in a little apartment. And she said it had been 3 days, and it almost knocked her off her feet when she opened the door. She said she couldn't get it out of her hair. She kept washing her clothes. She had to throw away some of her clothes. She said a couple weeks later, she'd walk into a room and people, "What's going on?" And so the stench of a body decaying is, and that's exactly why Martha, I always like to say that Martha is kind of the Martha Stewart of her own day. Can still get away with that, but she's the homemaker. And this is a serious faux pas. These people have come out to commiserate with her over her brother's death, and now you're going to expose them to what's going to come rolling out of there? Oh. But Jesus contrived to show up on the fourth. He waited 2 days. Why? Because you can't counterfeit a death stench. That makes sense to you? And so there's no question that man was dead. There's no way to manufacture what they were wiping off their mustaches for 2 weeks, you know what I'm saying? So I say all that to make the point that Lazarus, okay, here's the important thing. And it seems to me that the miracle there with Lazarus is maybe the only miracle where Jesus contrives to make it more dramatic than it might have been. He waits 2 days. And I think the reason is because it provides the proof, absolutely undeniable, olfactory proof that the man was dead. All right. What's fascinating is that John, as is his wont, that is the fourth gospelist, spends a good deal of time talking about the effect. And I'm going to go through it quickly, but it's very important to the Passion Week. I'm asking the question, it may not seem like it, but I'm asking the question, how did Jesus get away with the triumphal entry? How in the world did he get away with it? And I think Lazarus is, and by the way, John 11 is where John begins his Passion Week story. It's several weeks earlier, but he's setting the scene because he says in John 11, first of all, in verse 45, he says, many of the Jews, and those are the Jewish leaders in John's nomenclature, when they saw these things, they believed. So some of the ruling Jews, some of the aristocratic Jews, some of the Sanhedrin Jews, one of them, Joseph of Arimathea, but when they saw this, they thought, that's the real thing. But the others went to Caiaphas, who is the high priest. All right, time out. Sanhedrin. Everybody know the Sanhedrin? It's the ruling body. Rome ruled everything, but they don't want to mess you with either local or religious politics. And so in every place there was some sort of body. Remember in Ephesus, it's the assembly. Remember that you better not. Well, here it's the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin, every town had a Sanhedrin. It just means council. But the great Sanhedrin, 70 men, evenly divided between Pharisee and Sadducee, by the way. But the point is that Caiaphas, the high priest, ruled over the Sanhedrin. So they went to this governing Jewish body, and they told, and Caiaphas, and what, it's such an important, theologically, it's so deep. But let me just show you what happens. Most of the Jews, the Sanhedrin, it says in verse 53, from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. And I'm going to put together with that verse 57, where it says the chief priests and the Pharisees, time out. Chief priests, Sadducees. That's how, the word Sadducees is the old word, but all of our versions use the word chief priests. It means the leadership of the priestly caste, and they were the Sadducees. So notice what it says. I just read it. The chief priests and the Pharisees, they despised one another. This is I don't know, Bernie Sanders and, I don't know, think of the most conservative congressman you can think of in this, agreement. They couldn't agree on anything except we got to get this man dead. So the chief priests and the Pharisees, that ought to draw you up short when you see those two. But it says they had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it that they might seize him. So now understand, throughout the Passion Week, Jesus is a fugitive. There is an official declaration the man is to be arrested. And in all that we think about, remember that Jesus has to be so clever, so circumspect, that he frustrates that determination on the part of the Pharisees. So, number one, because of Lazarus, Jesus is a fugitive. I mean, they've been anxious to put him to death before, but now it's official, and they put out the word. Jesus' picture is on every post office wall in Israel, you know what I'm saying? He's a wanted man, officially. That's important. Secondly, it says, therefore, he went to a place called Ephraim. Now, this is where we're going to pick the story up. He went to a place called Ephraim. I'll talk about it. And there remained. He is hiding out. And then thirdly, and this is so fascinating, John tells us, I love the Gospel of John. It's so deliberate that he's fleshing out the synoptics and so on. But he says the Passover Jews was near. Many went up the country to purify themselves, and they sought Jesus. Now, his reference is to the Passover was one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts, and so in the Old Testament they were under obligation, and in the culture this was a feast where they would often go to Jerusalem. But if you had incurred any sort of impurity, whether you touched a human dead body, you had an open sore, contagious disease, a woman had had a child, and so on, you had to attend to the rites of purification. And so the city would begin to swell to several times, even before Passover, as people came up to attend. Does that make sense to you? So John is saying, now remember, John is writing about 85 AD. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, Israel is destroyed. And so he's careful to kind of explain these things. It would have been common to, if this were Matthew writing, he wouldn't have to say that. But John knows his audience, so he's making the point that there were all sorts of Jewish pilgrims who were coming from all over early to attend to those rites. And then he says this, they sought Jesus and they spoke among themselves. Now that little phrase right there, they spoke among themselves. What it means is they whispered. They knew that there was a price on Jesus' head. They knew that the very powerful leadership was determined to be rid of Jesus, but they were fascinated. So they spoke among themselves as they stood in the temple, and this is their question: what do you think? That he'll not come to the feast? So because of Lazarus, and I would say this is probably only a couple of weeks before the Passover. I think it's very, very close to the Passover. But John doesn't tell us exactly, but for reasons I won't get into. But the point is that, number one, Jesus is a fugitive. He's a wanted man. Number two, because he's wise as a serpent, he hides himself in a place called Ephraim. I'll talk about it, a little village north of Jerusalem. Number three, the whole city of Jerusalem is a Twitter with the question: do you think the Nazarene will come? All right, now watch. I got to be very quick with this. But here is the answer as to how Jesus got away with it. And I'm going to harmonize Scripture unapologetically. But I'm going to, here, all right, so this is Perea. That's where he was. This is Jerusalem. But now he, having raised, Bethany is just to the east of Jerusalem. But having raised, you know, I'm saying this, and you don't even see it yet because it lags. So nuts to it. Let me just go to this. See how long. Hello. Is it going to work at it? All right. I'm going to, you know what? You can go on your notes. This is pretty small and disappointing. But on page, I should just grab one of these, shouldn't I? I don't have to keep borrowing them. You go back to the early part of the notes and page, at page 9, I give you this just real quickly in a little, yeah, there. So, all right, I'm just going to explain it to you because that PowerPoint is going to lag, and you could go back and check on it yourself. I'm going to put two passages together. Number one is Luke 17 and verse 11. And Luke 17 says, as he made his way to Jerusalem, he passed through the midst of, hold on here. Now, I don't know how long it'll be to that catch up. But it says this: he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Now, Ephraim is a little city and is described as actually near the frontier. Sometimes it's translated near the wilderness and we think of the Dead Sea. That's not the point at all. It's talking about the boundary between Judea to the north, to the south, and Samaria to the north. Now, the Samaritans despised the Jews. They had no, to use the woman's at the well, you know, they have no dealings. And during the feast season, they were especially, all right, well, where am I? Here it comes. No, I don't know if it's going to make it or not. I think it's a function of our internet connection, you know, but here's the thing. Jesus goes, because he's wise as a serpent, to a little village right on the border. Now, let me give you one other point of background. Remember in John chapter 4, when Jesus, very early in his ministry, took his disciples and said, we're going to go to Galilee, and I need to go through Samaria. Now, I know that the standard understanding, and frankly, I'm going to reject this, but the standard understanding is that Jesus somehow supernaturally, divinely knew that there was a woman that he needed to witness to. I don't think that's the point at all. I don't think that's how Jesus lived. He had to plan a day just like you and I. Now, I think the reason Jesus wanted to go through Samaria, because it was unspeakably strategically important that he gain standing in Samaria. And so, now again, there is a route by which you can make your way from, most of the Jews in Israel in that day lived in Galilee. Small minority lived in Judea, Jerusalem. Judea is tough living. Galilee is the nicest living on earth for that day. How are you going to get from Galilee to Jerusalem? Well, there were two routes. One, you could go straight down the ridge route, but you had to go right through Samaria. The other route was to go down to the Jordan Rift, cross over the Jordan, go down the east side of the Jordan River, reford the river at Jericho, and come up from the east. Does that make sense to you? The one is called the ridge route, right? Follows the ridge, north and south. The other is called the rift, because there's this rift. You're familiar with that? The Jordan Rift, deepest rift on the face of the earth. And so the point is, normally they would have taken the rift route. But Jesus says to his disciples, John 4, I need to go through Samaria. Well, it wasn't feast season, which means there's not going to be quite as much danger. And besides, he's got some husky guys with him. But what Jesus does, and I think he is looking for this opportunity, and I think he probably did this more than once, but John picks this one time and tells us about the time when he encounters that woman at the well and leads her to an understanding of himself. She becomes a believer in the Nazarene. She goes and tells the village. The village loves him. They beg him to stay. Remember all that? Jesus had standing in Samaria. That's hugely important. One element, listen, so important to read the Bible in terms of its own culture. And one very dominant Old Testament, New Testament element of that culture is they lived as clans. So he extended families, and you interacted with that clan as a clan. I have a friend he's a friend. He owns a restaurant I go to, and I work with his son. He's got a ministry, but I was talking to him. He's in Jericho, and he told me one time he was going to Houston. I said, Houston? You got people in Houston? Oh, yeah, I got people in Houston. I said, really? Yeah, we started going there decades ago, and I got a lot of family in Houston. I said, about how many? He said, I think about 1,200. So, I mean, that was that clan, and they identified as clan. So Jesus has standing in Samaria, and he's going to use it. When nobody else can make his way through Samaria because of the danger, he does it. You have it remarkably when he goes in Luke 9, he goes to the Feast of Tabernacles, and he goes through Samaria, and it says one Samaritan village wouldn't accept him. Remember that? And that's when Peter and James and John wanted to call him. And it says, so we went to the next village. So the point is that now in Luke 17, he goes to Ephraim. Now listen, Jesus was a Galilean. Remember that Luke is explicit that every year Joseph would take his family, Joseph his adopted father, so Jesus knew the habits of the Galilean Jews and how they made their way to Jerusalem. So the point is that, and I give you a map here, but it's going to take too long. I'm going to leave it there. It'll take a minute to catch up, but no, it's coming. All right, now look at the black line. Let me just try it, see if this works. I shouldn't. No, we'll just go with it. What I want you to see is Jesus is in Ephraim. Now, on the map there, that's where that story, you see it on the left there, it's pretty small, but where that line begins on the left, that's Ephraim. And the Bible is explicit, Luke 17, that passing through Samaria, the midst of, it's twice explicit in the Greek, both the case ending and the preposition, it couldn't be more explicit. The midst of Samaria and Galilee. And Jesus knew the habits of the Galilean Jews. Now, I don't have it marked there, but you see that black line where it goes up, and at its greatest extension on the left, or on the northwest, see that? That's the valley of Jezreel, the most important valley on the face of the earth. And when you are in the valley of Jezreel, you're in the heart of Galilee. Once you come down off the hills of Samaria or Ephraim, beautiful, beautiful valley. And that valley is, in fact, the valley of Jezreel. And you're in Galilee. Now, when you made the trip from Galilee in the north down to Jerusalem for Passover, you never did it alone. It was always going to be dangerous. So you would travel in companies. And it might be a village, it might be a clan, it might be a synagogue, a little bit of each. But you're going to have, a good number of people and several dozen, if not a couple hundred people. And the men are going to be on the outside, and the women and children are going to be inside, and so on. So you're just very, very wary of danger. That makes sense. So you make very careful preparation. And so what they would do is that they would come. What happened right there? Let me see if it's me. We lost the Zoom. All right, but you've seen enough that I can walk you through this. So what they would do is they would come out of their villages and so on, and they would gather in the valley of Jezreel, and then they would make their way down to the Jordan Rift through a valley called the Harod Valley, and then make their way all the way down and then back across the Jordan and up the backside or the east slope of the Mount of Olives. That make sense to you? But Jesus, as he sets out from Ephraim, goes through the heart of Samaria and Galilee. Now, you know enough geography to know that if Jesus is doing that, he's got Jerusalem in the rearview mirror. So why, on the way to Jerusalem, does he set out going north? And the answer is simply that he knows the habits of the Jewish travelers, and so the pilgrims. So he goes up, and he and the 12 join in with one of those bands of Passover pilgrims. And now they're going to make their way, and Matthew and Mark tell this story very fully, and they're going to make their way. And this is a trip of about 90 miles. And so it's going to take at least 5 or 6 days. And during those days, Jesus is doing miracles. He's healing the 10 lepers. He's healing the blind men at Jericho. He's teaching. He's being very much the provocateur, I like to say, because when he gets to Jericho, he's going to deliberately call a tax collector out of the tree. Remember that, Zacchaeus and so on? There would have been such a gasp and so on. So Jesus is behaving very messianically, and he's making his way for 5 or 6 days all the way down the Jordan Rift. But then John 17 says, I'll just quote it for you. John 12 says this: 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. All right, now listen. Bethany of course, it says he came to the place where he had where Lazarus lived. Bethany is on the slope. You're coming, there's Jericho, there's the Dead Sea. You've been making your way down the rift. Now you start the very, very steep ascent called the Ascent of Adumim, and you're making your way up to Jerusalem. You're going to have to cross the Mount of Olives and then cross the Kidron to get there. Just before you crest the Mount of Olives, there is a little road that goes off to the south, and that's Bethany. And so all of these people, they're excited, and they've been with Jesus for several days, and there are probably people who set out on crutches, and they've thrown those crutches away, and now and of course your goal is Jerusalem, and you watch as Jesus and the 12 wave goodbye, and they take that little spur road off to Bethany. You know exactly where he's going. It's Friday. What happens when the sun goes down on Friday? Shabbat begins. You got to be ready for Shabbat. And so they want to get into Jerusalem. So hear me. Now listen, I am putting the story together, but every scintilla of it is based on explicit verses. All right, he went to Ephraim. He set out, Luke 17, through Samaria. Matthew and Mark have him joining in with those Passover pilgrims in these big crowds. By the way, that reality that you travel and remember when at the age of 12 Jesus stayed behind, and both Mary and Martha them too. Both Mary and Joseph thought he was in the company. See the point? And then at night you gather as nuclear families, if you don't mind. You know, we lost the Messiah. This is serious stuff. But that's Luke 2. But what I'm saying is that now Jesus goes up and he joins in, and all the way along he is doing these miracles, and everybody is so excited. And he, on Friday afternoon at some time, he goes off to Bethany to keep Shabbat with Lazarus. All those people they want to get into the city. And here's an interesting little tidbit. One of the most widely observed rabbinical laws was called the Sabbath day's journey. And it's rabbinical, but it makes a lot of sense, to be honest with you. And so the Sabbath day's journey is about 1 2/5 miles. Now, it's not linear. It's not like you got to, use up your steps and then sit down and wait for the sun to go down. It's a zone. So on Friday, as the sun's going down, you just describe a circle around yourself of a radius about 1 2/5 miles. And you can go anywhere you want in that zone. Does that make sense? But if you're outside that zone, you can't come in. And the rabbis actually marked all the roads coming up to Jerusalem with the Sabbath zone. So here I am. I'm traveling with Jesus. I'm all excited. I watch this Friday afternoon. He goes off to Lazarus. And I'm thinking to myself, I got to figure out what I'm going to do for Shabbat. And clearly that's what he's going to do. And now I go a little ways and I see the Sabbath zone marker. So if I if I've never come to Jerusalem before, and that was the case with many, I still know that Bethany is outside the Sabbath zone. Does that make sense to you? So I go into the city. Now, what is the whole city abuzz about? Remember? Is the Nazarene going to come? That's what John says. The whole city is asking itself. And so I like to say that now I'm one of those pilgrims. I go into the city of Jerusalem, and I get my Warholian 15 minutes. Do you know the reference? You know what I'm saying? So I get my 15 minutes of fame because I know the question. And I have in your notes, and it's good to understand that as these thousands and thousands of excited pilgrims make their way into this waiting city, they have two messages. And the first message is, he is coming. You bet he's coming. I've been traveling with him. He's got his disciples. He is coming to the feast. But the second message is, he'll be here Sunday morning. Why? Because he stopped in Bethany. That's outside the Sabbath zone. So he's coming to the feast, but he won't come in on Saturday night. That's crazy. So he'll be here Sunday morning. Does that make sense to you? And the whole city, and so this is the way I understand it, that message just begins to percolate through this whole expectant city. And one by one, family by family, village by village, they're talking about it. You know, it's Shabbat, they're sitting around, they got time, and they say, have you heard that the Nazarene is coming to town? And there's only one road from Bethany to Jerusalem, and he'll be here tomorrow morning. And I think again and again, this conversation happens without any concert, but this has got, Jesus very carefully orchestrated this. And so the pilgrims are saying to themselves, man, I know my rabbi insists that Jesus is an imposter and that we should have nothing to do with him. But listen, how many degrees of separation could there have been at this time in the land of Israel between anybody and somebody who got healed? See what I'm saying? I know my rabbi says he's a crook, but man, you know, my neighbor, his daughter was blind, and now she sees. And besides that, you know what? I've had it to here with Rome. And besides that, we got promises in Daniel, so the time is right. So why don't we go just check it out? What's it going to cost us? Let's get up early. Let's just welcome him into the city. I don't know what to think, but let's just do it. So now Jesus, and I think his disciples, listen, he was a wanted man. And I imagine his disciples, as they thought, man, what are we thinking about? We're going to ride into the city, and maybe they hear the rumble of the crowd on the other side of the mountain, and they think, oh, we're in trouble now. And they crest the mountain, and this whole city is throwing their garments down, they're waving palm branches, and they're crying out. What did Jesus said? You're not going to see me till you cry, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's what they're doing. Does that make sense to you? So I'm saying that the grand question in my mind, and we've talked about the triumphal entry, I'll leave it alone, day of messianic presentation. How did Jesus get away with it? I think that's the answer. That Jesus, and I think it's right out of the Bible. And Jesus alerted the city. You know, it's in John 12 and verse 12. In John the Apostle, John 12 and verse 12, in his telling of the triumphal entry, he begins by saying this: when those who had came to Jerusalem for the Passover heard that Jesus was coming, how did they hear? Jesus alerted the city. Does that make sense to you? Now, 2 points. And we'll go on to the next one. Number one, Dorothy asked, and it's a really good question. If you go to Matthew 23, and that is late on the Tuesday of the Passion Week. Matter of fact, I'll read it to you. Maybe we can get this back, but I'm not going to mess with it. Let me just take you to, you can go in your scriptures to Matthew 23, and what verse, Dorothy? What? 39. I just don't have another Bible, so I'm going to read it here. Matthew 23 and 39. This is Tuesday. And Jesus says to the crowd on Tuesday as he leaves the city, for the last time, by the way, under his own power, first of all, he says that Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. So it's word for word, the same as Luke 13, 31 to 35. Word for word. But he says again, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this. And Dorothy had realized that, figured it out. But the fact is, these are not parallel events. In other words, they're not two tellings of the same event. They're very similar, and I think that's bottomlessly significant. Because in Perea, with regard to the triumphal entry, as we know it, Jesus has said, you'll not see me. And we thought that can't happen. It did happen. Jesus took steps to make it happen. And I think this would have resonated in the ears of people in that day, as he leaves the city, he says again, on Tuesday, he says, you're not going to see me again. Now, he's going to go out to Bethany. He's going to be there on Wednesday. He's going to come back into the city on Thursday for the upper room. In Gethsemane, he's going to be arrested and crucified. But before that, he says, you'll not see me until you cried out, blessed. The difference between Luke 13, a lot of differences, but the primary difference is the Luke 13 prophecy has already been fulfilled. It was fulfilled when Jesus rode into the city. The Matthew 23 prophecy is yet to be fulfilled. Now, I like to say it this way, Dorothy, that if you'd have been there on Luke 13, you'd have said, that's not going to happen. But Jesus made it happen. If you know anything about Jewish evangelism, if you know anything about, frankly, the hardness, the blindness, as Paul calls it, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday. It's just difficult to think that nation, that people, that ethnos will in fact cry out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, when a white horse rider descends in the future. But here's where I take hope. We'd have said that same thing about Luke 13, and Jesus made it happen. I take that as Ebenezer. He brought us this far, he'll take us the rest of the way. God, and that's the whole eschatological drama. The whole tribulation drama is about Israel. If you're here today as a believer, and I trust you are, it's because God brought you to the end of yourself, every one of you. Your problem is not weakness, it's pride. And God brings it. God knows how to bring Israel to the end of herself, and that's the tribulation. And the day is coming. You couldn't imagine it happening in Luke 13 in Perea. It's hard to imagine today in St. Louis to imagine how it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And God's going to make it happen. Does that make sense to you? I think it's an important thing. All right, so again, that's the triumphal entry Sunday. Now, I don't have a screen in front of you, but I'm going to have to remind yourself very quickly. I keep promising that, and I haven't delivered yet, but hold on. All right, I had this organized in my head, and I want to do a couple other things before we go to lunch, very quickly. All right, let me ask you to go to Matthew 23. Turn your Bible to Matthew 23. And I've already dealt with a lot of this, but the second question I would like to ask, and it's the question we've really addressed a couple of times, and that is, given Sunday, why Friday? And the answer is Monday and Tuesday. Now, to appreciate this, I want to lay before you a manifest, clear, undeniable dynamic of Jesus' ministry, of his rhetorical strategies, that is, again, very much overlooked. And that is this. Again and again, when there was this individual or group who insisted that they were willing to follow Jesus, he would test that willingness by making a difficult demand. That makes sense to you? I like to say that he would put his finger on the most sensitive nerve in your spiritual body. Do you get to heaven by selling everything you have and giving to the poor? Of course not. Why did he demand that of the rich young ruler? Because the rich young ruler was saying, I want to follow you, and you could tell by looking at him. I always say that Jesus was the most intuitive person who ever lived, and absent any omniscience or anything, and you and I could have figured out what was important to him, to the rich young ruler. And so Jesus simply says, all right, I'm going to put the test to that. In Luke chapter 4, when Jesus is at the synagogue in his Nazareth, his hometown, and the people are all so amazed with him. And they're so impressed. This is a local boy made good. We grew up 30 years. Jesus lived in Nazareth. There was never a season or event of his life that these Nazarenes didn't know well. It was just a small village. And now he had come and made that claim to messiahship and so on. Everybody was amazed. And then Jesus looked at him and he said, in the days of Elijah, there were a lot of lepers in Israel, but widows in Israel, but God sent Elijah to a Syrophoenician. There were a lot of lepers, but he sent Elisha to Naaman. What happened next? They tried to throw him off a cliff. What's going on there? All right, I'll give you, there's more background I should give you, but I'm going to say it very briefly. Jesus grew up in Nazareth. It was a small village, mostly either herdsmen, all sorts of animals, or farmers, and they would have a plot of ground. Listen, the Jews' habit is to cluster their homes around a synagogue because you want to go to synagogue, especially on Shabbat. There are 3 times a week, Saturday, Monday, Thursday, when there is a mid-morning service where they read the scriptures and pray and so on, and you'd like to be there. But if you don't live within 1.25 miles, you're not going to be able to go on Saturday mornings. Does that make sense to you? So they would cluster. And even in a small village, you might have, it's interesting, you know, they found Magdala, which was such an important New Testament synagogue, and it's not very big. And then a couple of years after they were excavating that, they found another one just a couple hundred yards away. Now, what in the world's going on here? Well, they were Baptist synagogues. No, I'm teasing. But the point is that that's what you would do. You would build a synagogue and you would cluster around so you could go. So there in Nazareth, it was just a cluster of clusters, if you don't mind. But the point is, Jesus comes back. Oh, Jesus grew up there. And you remember the reaction, was it Thomas, can any good thing come out? No, it wasn't. It was Philip, I guess. Huh? But can any good thing come out of Nazareth? What's at stake there is that near Nazareth, right, really adjacent to Nazareth, there was a small but important Roman military outpost. The main legionnaire camp was down on the floor of the valley of Jezreel, but Nazareth looks right down on the whole valley, which is the crossroads of international commercial traffic. And so there was a little outpost, and so these Nazarenes grew up with Roman soldiers, most of whom didn't speak the language, perhaps drunk half the time, you know what I'm saying, and with a sword in their side and so on. And Jesus knew that the people of Nazareth despised the Romans in a way that was wicked. And so when it seems like they're willing to follow him, he just simply says, you know what? God loves the Gentiles. That quick they want to throw him off. See what I'm saying? He is testing their willingness to bow the knee to him. You have it again and again. Most importantly in this regard is this, that you have the Pharisees. Now, let me just tell you everything you need to know about Pharisees and Sadducees. I've kind of adumbrated this. It's in that PowerPoint. And there's a lot more you should know, but everything, you're not going to get to square one if you don't understand this about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Just mark it down. It's quite easy. The Sadducees run the temple. And they run the temple because they bribed the Romans to let them do it. And they are absolute crooks, and they're unbelievers, they're totally Grecianized, and the people have nothing but contempt for the Sadducees, the chief priests. And they return the favor, by the way. They have nothing but contempt for the people. The Pharisees run the synagogue. Now, a synagogue's not a church, not a temple, it's a gathering place. And every Jewish person to this day builds his life around his synagogue. All of his relationships, his connections are in the synagogue. And the Pharisees, now this wasn't official, but you see, you can't have to this day a synagogue without a copy of the Torah. It's got to be handwritten. It's got to be on scroll. You can't have a codex, a book in a synagogue, an Orthodox synagogue, even the Reformed synagogue. You got to have a scroll. You got to have a copy of the 5 books. It's got to be hand copied onto a scroll. And the guy who does that is a scribe. A scribe, that's a guild. That's a profession. He's a professional copyist. And so Pharisees is just a fraternity of law keepers. The scribes are a guild of skilled copyists. But the point is that, as you can imagine, the Pharisees, they embrace the entire Hebrew scriptures as well as the extra, the fathers, but they loved the whole scriptures, and of course the scribes were in the business of copying, so they were joined at the hip, and that's why Jesus is going to call down curses on the scribes and the Pharisees. That makes sense to you? They're two disparate groups, but they go together absolutely. Now here's the thing: Sadducees run the temple, people hate their guts. Pharisees run the synagogue, the people revere the Pharisees. Because you see, the Pharisees are 24/7 law keepers. That's what they do. They very seldom had any sort of a job. They didn't keep a farm or anything like that. They lived on the alms of the people, and all they did every day was to try to obey the law more carefully, more sometimes ridiculously than anybody else. For instance, the Bible, the law says don't work on the Sabbath, but it doesn't define work very well, and so the rabbis had spelled that out. And for instance, to this day, as I understand, I've never seen it, but in many Jewish households, Orthodox Jewish households, on Friday before the sun goes down, the kids will go to a special drawer and they'll take all these little black cloths and they'll drape it over every mirror in the house. And the reason they do that is because if they don't, one of the women of the house might go by the mirror, forget it's Sabbath, look in, see a gray hair, pluck it out. That would be reaping. And so you got to cover the mirrors in your house. You could drag something across the dirt. I'm sorry, you could pick something up and move it, a chair or something, if you got a dirt floor part of your house. You couldn't drag it because you'd leave a furrow, and that's plowing. So, all of these rules and so on, and that's what the rabbis, I'm sorry, not the rabbis, those were the teachers. The Pharisees that's what they did. And here's the important point. The Pharisees taught convincingly that the way to be assured of entrance into the kingdom is to keep the law. And the more fastidiously, and there's been this kerfluffle called the New Perspective on Paul, which is such nonsense in my mind. But and their argument was, wait, you go back and read some of their literature, they talk about grace all the time. God's so gracious, we're saved by grace. Yeah. Now I don't mean this, and please don't take this offensively at all. And but I'm going to make a parallel. I think it's instructive, and I don't mean to be insulting. But you read Catholic theology, and all it talks about is God's grace. What they mean is God's so gracious, he gave us the sacraments. How easy is this? We just keep the sacraments. That's exactly parallel to the Pharisees. He's so gracious, he gave us the law. We just keep the law, and we'll get into the kingdom. And that's precisely the law of, the gospel of works righteousness that Jesus came to confront. But not only, why did the people revere well, we bought into their idea that the way to get into the kingdom is by keeping the law, and they do it 24/7. We can't do that. We got to go to work. But if I support them, if I encourage them, if I give them alms, I can get into the kingdom on their coattail. You have to understand that. The common man thinks his primary entrance into the kingdom is by virtue of supporting the Pharisees. And then you add one to, I like to say that the Pharisees were not only revered, they were also feared, because they could toss you aposynagoge. And I always say, don't be getting yourself thrown out of Christ Fellowship Bible Church. Shame on you if you do. But this is something of a different order. You probably live where you live because you want to be part of that synagogue. You probably at work, you're going to find a spouse for your mate, you're going to find work and so on in that synagogue. You get tossed out of the synagogue, you got to start over in life. It's a serious, serious thing. Remember John 9? They tossed him aposynagoge. So that's the dynamic. And I'm saying, given Sunday, why Friday? And I'm saying that, first of all, Jesus, in the most dramatic and really just soul-stirring way, Jesus spent 2 days claiming and demonstrating the reality of his messianic claim. So he drives it home, and I'm calling that a proclamation concerning himself. But the key to my thought here, given Sunday, why Friday, is because as he leaves the temple on Tuesday afternoon, Jesus delivers the last discourse of his life and of his ministry, and it is all right, in Matthew you got this is after of course, so it is the last one. It's Matthew, no, it's not either. All right, I'm confusing myself. Matthew has 5 discourses, and the 5th one is the Olivet Discourse. That happens just after this. But the last public, that's just to his disciples, remember? The last public discourse is Matthew 23. And what happens is he calls down the most excoriating woes on the scribes and Pharisees. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. You compass land and sea to make one proselyte. And when you've got him, he's twofold more the child of hell than he was before. I mean, this is scathing. Well, you are so many whited sepulchres. As I said earlier, the Jews normally buried in, in the back 40 somewhere, just someplace. And oftentimes, if nobody's died recently, the foliage would grow up, and it was hard to see it. You'd have to clear that away if you have to get out of it. And the problem was the people making the pilgrimage up to Jerusalem for a feast might want to rest for a few minutes, and they just lean down against the rock wall there, and they don't realize, and now you come and say, hey, that's Granddaddy's grave. And so now the poor guy who was on his way to Jerusalem for the feast is impure. He can't go to the feast. And so to deal with that, the rabbis had insisted that you put just a coat of white lime, just throw lime on the door of the tomb, just to mark it as a tomb. And so, and I think it's interesting that Jesus is on the Temple Mount, and to the east of the Temple Mount and 400 feet higher is the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives, because it's an unusual kind of limestone, has forever been especially useful for graves. Today there are tens of thousands of graves, there on the Mount of Olives. But I wonder if Jesus doesn't kind of sweep his hand over the horizon and say, you're like so many whited sepulchres, you look good, you kind of gleam in the sun, it looks nice, but you're full of dead men's bones, which means people just brush up against you and they become impure. The Jewish mind doesn't do real well with abstractions. It deals better with and when you read impure in the Bible, it means you stink. You don't like having people around you who stink, and neither does God. So that's the point. You're a stench. You're like so many whited sepulchres. Men just brush up against you, and they become a stench in the nostrils of God. You blind leaders of the blind, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. The rabbis had and the Pharisees especially, all this was very public. And so insects are unclean, but the rabbis had declared that if it's microscopic, it's okay. You got to let you get away with it as microscopic. So before when they would go to the market, they would stand there and they'd take a piece of lettuce and they'd put it up against the light and they'd soak it up. I mean, every single piece, every little tulip, everything, make sure it didn't have any, and because they didn't want to, they're straining out the gnat. You strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. I'm going to tell you something. That's hilarious. It really is, especially given the fact that everybody knew that these Pharisees, in large part, were horribly immoral and corrupt, but they did the law, and so, all right, so at any rate, here's my point. What Jesus is doing, and he winds up by saying in Matthew 23, at the end, he says, I better read it, I'll get it wrong, but he says, hold on. Oh, come on. Oh, I'm having a mess here. Let me just do this. All right. Matthew 23, this is the end. He says, this is before the lament. This is before he leaves the city. He says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you build the tombs of the... Oh, I'd love to talk about these things. But he says, fill up then the measure of your father's guilt, you serpents, you brood of vipers. Now listen, 2 points. Number one, this is exactly the same as the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount is so misunderstood in my mind. But what's Jesus doing in the Sermon on the Mount? The key, and this is early in his ministry, but the key verse everybody acknowledges to the Sermon on the Mount is, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never see the kingdom of God. When Jesus said that to these thousands of people gathered there just above the city of Capernaum, a gasp would have gone up. What? My Pharisee? And then the whole point of the sermon is, they say unto you, but I say unto you. And I like to say, in both Matthew 5 and Matthew 23, you'll really understand the passage better, you'll get in the moment better, if you picture Jesus pointing. So here are all these people, and over here there's a little gaggle of Pharisees, both in the plain beneath the hillside there in Galilee, and on Temple Mount, and Jesus is saying, "Woe unto you, scribes." Well, I think in Matthew he's saying, "They say unto you, but I say unto you." They say unto you. Then he winds up by saying, pointing, I think, "There's a broad way, help yourself, straight to destruction. There's a narrow way. You can build your house on the sand, or you can build it on a rock." Now, what is Jesus doing in both Matthew 5 and Matthew 23? He's driving the city to a decision. I said before that he puts his finger on the most sensitive nerve. Well, God had contrived to provide for Jesus the perfect backdrop, what's the word I want? The foil, the perfect foil for his message. You got to trust in me. And in order to turn to God, you got to turn from idols. And that's your idol right there. So if you're willing to turn from that, then and so both in Matthew 5 and Matthew 23, Jesus is saying, you make the choice. That makes sense to you? Given Sunday, why Friday? Because on Tuesday, Jesus he made the case for his messiahship dramatically, unmistakably, and then as he left the city, he said, you choose. It's either me or the Pharisees. And it's going to cost you. Ask the man born blind that it's going to cost you if you identify with me and reject the Pharisees, but you're not going to have it. I like to say it. That makes sense to you? Listen, on Tuesday afternoon, Jesus drove that swollen Passover city to a decision. It's either me or the Pharisees. Now, they're going to have about 3 days to think about it, and it's going to percolate through the city. Early Friday morning, city doesn't know it. They're sleeping. Jesus has been arrested. He's been turned over to be, no, he hadn't yet been turned over to be crucified. He's been turned over by the Jewish leadership to Pilate. You have that drama. Now the city begins to wake. I'm jumping to Friday morning. The city is waking up. Pilate says to that city, and by the way, this was genius. Pilate had figured out a way to get out of this mess. And so he said, I'll just go straight to the people. I'm going to give them a choice. We had decided on Barabbas, but I'm going to give them a choice. And I watched them welcome Jesus on Sunday. I watched them celebrate him on Monday, Tuesday. There's no doubt they're going to choose Jesus. What a genius I am. I'll just go to the Pharisees and say, oh, sorry, guys, you know, the people, it's not my fault. So he says, who would you have me give you, Jesus or Barabbas? And at that moment, the city announced its verdict with regard to the choice Jesus had demanded of them on Tuesday night. Does that make sense to you? Given Sunday, why Friday? It's because Jesus tested the apparent willingness of the city to accept him on Sunday. And he did so by saying, you choose. It's me or the Pharisees. I like to say it this way, that on Sunday, Jesus rode into the city of Jerusalem, and he was offering himself as the fulfillment of that long-awaited, that promise of deliverance from sin and so on. And it was a legitimate, he can make that promise, he can make that offer because he's going to do it. He's going to provide the means by which he can provide, that he can provide forgiveness for you. So on Sunday, the message is, I am the fulfillment. I offer myself to you as your long-awaited deliverer from the curse of sin and death. That's Sunday. Monday and Tuesday, the message is this. You don't take Jesus on your terms. You take him on his terms. And his terms mean you abandon all hope of self-righteousness. And no matter what it costs you, you give yourself, your allegiance to this one who has proven himself the fulfillment of that. Now, as I say, the city is going to announce its verdict on Friday morning. Now, let me do one other thing, and I'm going to do this quickly. So that's Sunday, Monday, days of Messianic proclamation, given Sunday, why Friday? That's my second question. My third question, and then we'll deal with one more after lunch. My third question is, and this is a lot of fun, but I said it this way. how can I say it? I want to make it a question. How came the Sanhedrists to, here's the question. All right, I'm just going to forget the question. Let me just, if you go to Matthew 26 and Mark 14 and Luke 22, all three of those passages are parallel. And they basically say this, and it's Tuesday night, it's explicit. So late on Tuesday night, the Sanhedrists, the Jewish leadership, it's explicit, gathered together and they said, we got to put this man to death, but not during the feast season, lest there be an uproar among the people. So it is tremendously curious that on Tuesday night, the perpetrators of the most wicked crime in human history, the murder of the Messiah, have despaired of getting it done during the Passover season. We can't do it. And the reason was because Jesus was so careful. He covered himself with the popularity. Now, the popularity is superficial, it's self-serving, it's going to evaporate, but the Pharisees and Jesus' enemies don't know that, both Roman and Jewish. Remember, the fear is a riot. That's what it says, lest there be an uproar. Now, I always think if you live through this, so you know you live there and wherever you live in Nazareth, whatever, and you know the story. Maybe you become a follower of Jesus and you love the story of how he gave himself and so on. But now somebody walks into your village and said, "I got this book, and it was written by Matthew and some of the other apostles. It's called the Gospel of Matthew. I want to read it to you." Oh yeah, so you open up, and he gets to Matthew 26, and it says, so 2 days before the Passover, that the Sanhedrin said, we can't get it done during the Passover, lest there be a rupture. You're going to say, now wait a minute. It happened on the high day of Passover. And yet on Tuesday night, they had given up on it. What happened? Judas. Now, there was a feast, and I could spend a lot of time on this. I love it. But there had been a feast in Bethany on Saturday night. Jesus had arrived on Friday night, John 12, kept the Passover. Saturday night there was a feast at the house of a man named Simon. By the way, what else do we know about Simon? Simon the leper. That's curious. If you got an invitation, come on over, we're going to have a meal. Simon the leper, we're going to have finger food. No, it's a cheap joke. But the point is, that clearly Simon was no longer a leper. And I think there may have been more than one person. Lazarus and his family were glad because he'd been brought from the dead. I think very probably Simon had been healed of his leprosy. And so he had good reason to celebrate this Nazarene. So there's a feast, and at that feast, Jesus is anointed by Martha. Mary, I'd love to talk to you about this. And Jesus issues, listen, everybody in the room, and you would have too. You know what? Know this when you're in the Bible story. In that culture, there were two elements of life that we take very, very much for granted that were very rare: color and scent. And rich, deep, beautiful perfumes, very expensive. And when she popped the cork on that thing, everybody in the room was, what in the... And then she began, and if she had just dabbed it on his head, you'd have thought, she began to lavish it on him. And everybody in the room, and you would have too. Mary, do you know what you're doing? This is crazy. And Jesus, it's not, he says, leave her alone. I think what he is saying is, what he is saying, I know what he's saying, but I think the spirit is this. No. Don't rebuke her. She has done, for several months, Jesus has been saying again and again, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die. On the third day, I'll rise again. I can only find one person in the entire record who believed him. That was Mary. She actually believed him. And therefore, he said, as long as this story is told, she's going to remember. Now, the point is, Jesus' rebuke was general on everybody. There was only one person in the room who took offense, and it was Judas. You know what? Here's a principle of life. Never forget it. It's quite simple, and you'll watch it happen before your eyes again and again. Sin makes you stupid. And when I say that, I mean not only you can't do good arithmetic. What I mean is your whole worldview. Everything that happens, you get it wrong, and where you should be appreciative, you're going to be angry, and so on. And so there was only one guy, and the wicked flee when no man pursues, and he was robbing from and so when Jesus said, no, leave her alone, he took personal offense. That was on Saturday night. Now, that simmered in Judas's wicked, unbelieving, angry soul spirit for 3 days. I can't prove this to you at all, but I'm going to check when I meet him for the first time. I think maybe this is what Paul has in mind when he says in Ephesians 4, let not the sun go down on your wrath, neither give place to the devil. Because Judas, offended by that, I think I can show you that too out of Luke 22, offended by that very gentle rebuke made to everybody, but it drove him nuts. So on Tuesday night, Satan used it, the anger, and so Judas sneaked off and made that bargain on Tuesday night. So I'm asking the question, how did they contrive? And there's a lot of confusion as to what Judas was hired to do. And the confusion is a lot of people think that he was hired to identify Jesus, as if the Sanhedrinists wanted to arrest Jesus, but they couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Probably not. Would you agree? The fact is that idea comes from the kiss, but the kiss was for the soldiers. The Romans did not allow the Jews any sort of force of arms. And so if they had an arrest to make, they had to go get soldiers. They're going to get 600 soldiers. We'll talk about it. And the fact is that they didn't know Jesus. And so but Luke is explicit. Luke 22 and verse 6 says they gave him money, and he set out to help them betray Jesus in the absence of the multitude. That was his whole job. And as I said this morning, the time when they knew he was going to be in the absence is at Passover. Now, do you recall the story, I know you do, in Luke 22 especially, verse 7, of when Jesus said on Thursday afternoon to Peter and John, go prepare for Passover. And they said, where do you want us to prepare? And he said, go into town, you'll see a man carrying a pitcher of water. Folks, be patient with me, but think carefully about this. I know that is very standard to say that Jesus omnisciently knew about that man. Think about it. That makes no sense. It's not coherent. What's he doing there? I think one of the things that happened on that Silent Wednesday is that Jesus had made preparation. I think he maybe went to Lazarus. It's a quiet day. He's in Bethany. And maybe he goes to Lazarus, his host, and says, I need to borrow one of your servants. I'm making this part up. It's something like this, I think, is behind it. And he gets this servant, and he says, now listen, there's a woman who lives in a very nice home in the gated community, high on a western hill in Jerusalem. Her name is Mary. She has a son named Mark. And she has a large upper room furnished for a feast, and for reasons I won't get into right now, I think that she's probably not going to be using that feast room. Ask her if I could use it with my apostles to keep the Passover. And, okay, by the way, too many by the ways. But understand, most people, the city swelled to several times its size. Most people lived in tents. Jews never went anywhere without a tent in their back. Tents were so important. This is why tent-making trade was such a big deal. And Jerusalem is surrounded on all sides by hills higher than itself. And the rabbis had said that when the Hebrew Scriptures say that you have to slay the Passover and eat the Passover lamb at the place, they'd say what that means is you have to be within eyesight. And at both Shiloh and Jerusalem, interestingly, the place where the tabernacle sat, then the place, the Temple Mount, on all sides there are hills higher. And so you'd bring your tents, and you would just, maybe put 2 or 3 tents together, and you get your family, and you get the lamb, and you go in, and you go inside, leave your shoes on, and you were eating it within. So that's probably what I imagine the disciples thought, well, probably they had their tents on their back. They never went in without it, but that's probably what we'll do. But Jesus says to, this is how I'm imagining it, ask her, and if it's okay, if she's able to do that, have her take one of her servants and just have him at a certain gate with a pitcher of water. Now, a pitcher of water is genius as a signal because men normally didn't carry water. It was women and children. Now, it's not bizarre. People are not going to stop and stare. It's not a two-headed chicken or something, but it's a perfect signal. And so, in fact, that's what happens. What is Jesus doing? Folks, think about it. He is keeping the place secret from Judas. He knew it was afoot, and if Judas knew the place where they were going to keep the Passover, the soldiers would have been waiting, and you'd have had no upper room. You'd have had no discourse. You'd have had no Gethsemane experience. And so that's what I'm saying. Judas agrees to help them arrest him in the absence of the multitude. He's anxious to find out where it's going to be, where the Passover is going to be. Jesus keeps it secret from him. You know, when Jesus gathered in the upper room, he said to his disciples, "You don't know with what desire I have desired." Now, when I trace history in the Bible, and specifically Jesus, I am happy with the mundane. A lot of people want to find spiritual meanings, you know what desire, why was. I'm sure there were other things, but I think what he's saying is, I moved heaven and earth to make sure we had this time together. This didn't happen accidentally. You don't know how I've worked to make sure we'd have this work, so that Judas didn't know where it was. But at any rate, now you take that with you, and Peter and John do that, and they prepare the room, and then Jesus leads them up there to the room, and Judas is doing a slow burn. He's saying, I gotta get out of here. I got 30 pieces of silver jangling in my purse here, and I got 70 Sanhedrists waiting. I got 600 soldiers waiting. I got Pilate waiting in the middle of the night to try him, and nothing can happen until I let him know where he is. And that's why, as I say, time comes where Jesus, and again, sin makes you stupid, and when Jesus does that niceness and hands him the sop, Satan uses that. He's sitting there. By the way, when Jesus in the upper room at the Passover table, when Jesus said, "The hand of the betrayer is with me at the table," and all the apostles began to say, who could it be? Who could it be? Matthew says explicitly that Judas, who was next to Jesus, I think, he leaned over and said, "Master, is it I?" And Jesus says, "It is." So at that point, all duplicity, all hopes that I'm doing this secretly, that's gone. Jesus is on to me, but sin makes you stupid. And so Judas said, "I'm going through with it." And Jesus says, "Go and do what you're going to do." And so Judas goes off to fetch the soldiers. He's got to walk all the way north of the city to the fortress Antonia. Meanwhile, Jesus remains there in the upper room and introduces the Lord's Supper, and then he begins to preach. John 14, "Let not your heart be troubled," but in John 14:31, it says he said, "Arise, we need to get out of here. Arise, let us go hence." A lot of times, John 14, 15, 16, even 17 are called the upper room discourse, but only 14 was in the upper room. 15 and 16 were on their way down. But what would have happened? Judas would have returned to the upper room. That's where he left Jesus. And when he found it empty, John says this. John is so helpful. He says Judas knew the place because they often stayed there. So Judas says there's only one place in the whole swollen city that he could have gone at this hour of night with 11 guys. So he follows Jesus, and of course Jesus meanwhile has been in Gethsemane, and now he emerges, and Judas shows up to arrest him. Does that make sense to you? So Judas is certainly a primary player, but it is just fascinating, and we're going to develop this tomorrow morning. It is fascinating to me that by reason of, how shall I say it? By reason of that plot, by reason of the sinful attitude of Judas, by reason of the fact that they hired him to help them arrest him in the absence of the multitude, Jesus is, I said before, that their plot was to get Jesus arrested, sentenced, executed, and on his way to, sentenced and on his way to execution. They came that close. It's amazing. They had to be feeling, his enemies, they had to be feeling pretty good about themselves. We got him arrested during the night, but Pilate digs in his heels, and so the city starts to wake up just before he's turned over to be crucified. Does that make sense to you? All right, let's go to lunch. It's late, for heaven's sakes. Let me just pray. I'm going to thank God for you folks. I'm asking a lot of you here, so thank you so much. Any questions, I'd love to entertain. Well, let's go to lunch for now. Father in heaven, again, we thank you so much I thank you for this church, for this body of believers, for this body of Christ in the midst of St. Louis. Thank you for their willingness to give us Saturday to focus in on what is very, very worthy of their attention. But but it has to be a very deliberate focus. And so thank you for them, and thank you for the time together. And I'd ask that you would take the instruction, as feeble as it is, that you would just empower it with your Spirit, by your Spirit, and drive it home to our hearts. Thank you for those who have prepared the food and for the time we have, and we'd ask your blessing upon it, and then go before us throughout the day. Thank you in Christ's name, amen. Okay.